Start the recording. All right, welcome to the second session in the Craft of Research series. Today we're going to talk about an approach to how to do literature reviews. And as I have mentioned, we're basically over here in the iceberg that unifies our journey, right? And what we're going to be doing is moving mostly under the surface, and then next week we'll talk about how to write this up as a theory. The most controversial thing I probably say, at least the most controversial thing some of your teachers will think I say, and I should at this point stress immediately that if there's any tension between what I tell you and what your teachers or supervisors tell you, your teachers and supervisors are right and I am wrong, right? So we're gonna have to have that deal. But like I said, one of the most controversial things I say is you should never write a literature review. Right? And I know that many of you are being told explicitly you have to write a literature review. What you should be doing is reviewing the literature, right? You should really look for the literature that you need. You should read and understand that literature, and you should use it to construct a compelling theory. And then it is true that sometimes it's useful to write part of your theory as a story about how the research developed to give you the model that you will then actually apply in your work, right? So there is a kind of a literary way of going about it where you're not really writing a review of everything that's been said or done or, in the literature. But what you are doing is just writing basically the backstory or the origin story, if you will, or the backstory for a compelling theoretical view of the world, right, which is shared by people. And that, just so if we can keep that in mind, that's really what I'm trying to pitch here, is that by reviewing the literature, you're trying to establish a view of the world that you share with your reader. And we'll get back to that when we talk about theory. Good. So, like I don't usually use slides or anything like that. I hope that the light is okay with you guys. What I'm going to suggest to you is that when you are reviewing the literature, don't go in just totally blindly on keywords or topics or even data or facts or anything like that. Don't look immediately at the first pass. Don't look to become knowledgeable about the subject. What you want to do is get involved in a conversation about the topic that you're getting into. You want to say, there is out there an interesting conversation going on about the things that we're studying, that we want to do research on in our project. If you keep that focus, it'll be much easier to navigate in the literature. So what you should do is start with 1 or 2 or 3 papers or books that you genuinely think are interesting. Right? So start from a point where you say that here's a text, here's a piece of writing, I think it's interesting, and I think I understand it somewhat. And there's actually an even higher standard we can set. We can say, this is a piece of research that I would have liked to do. Right? So it's going to use a theoretical model that I find interesting. It's kind of the way I see the world, right? It has a compelling view of the world. And it's going to collect data that I would grant would be a relevant way of studying the world. Right? So if you can find just a handful of papers that have that quality to them, right? And we're going to put those at the center of our problem. And we'll just say, let's say there's 3. Just because then we have a nice little triangle. I'm going to say we have 3 papers, and they're kind of at the center of our attention. They should be relatively recent. So one of the things we can do here is we can say, that's the present, here's the past, and here's the future. Sorry. I want to go. You don't want to put papers in the future, right? So there's going to be this sort of the present moment, right, of the past. There's going to be this area where these papers, they don't have to be super recent. They can be like 5 or 7 years old. That's fine. But you want something that sort of indicates the current state of the research. Like I say, you want to try to make sure it's something you find interesting and useful and compelling. And you also maybe want to check with your supervisors and teachers, is this something that we acknowledge as credible work in the area? Right? I know some of your project supervisors and some of your coordinators are pretty good at saying, these journals are the ones we use in our discipline. So here's a list of 10 journals. If it's published there, probably okay. Maybe avoid this other one, stay away from that one. That could be a bad one, this sort of thing, right? But usually just talking to each other and to your supervisors and teachers will be a good way of just finding out, are these credible things? But also, do I think they're good and interesting, right? Do I like them? So you start there, and then you do this thing that we just did, right? We say, look, for every paper in our here in our list, I'll do this in 2 colors. For every paper here, there's going to be a list of like a reference list, right? It's going to have a reference list, right? And so will the next one. I'll also have a reference list, right? There's going to be lots of these papers are going to have reference lists of various kinds, and there'll be some overlap to them, and some of them are going to be unique, right? And this is, of course, where using a citation database will get you kind of into, I've got 3 papers here, maybe 4, maybe 5, and I'm now also generating a list of all the references that some of them they share, some of them are unique to them, but I've got all their references as well, right? Now, you don't have to actually make that list, but you just have to be aware that there's going to be dozens, and maybe even hundreds of references in the wake of, as it were, these papers, right? And they say something important about how these papers are related to each other, because they're all following in this tradition. These papers will be published, like I say, maybe 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago. And so they're actually also going to have some new papers that are being published in the future, in their future, right? That will be citing them. So you want to keep track of that as well. And if you're using the citation databases, what you're doing is you are carefully going through and you're saying, which are the cited references, right? Which are the citing articles, right? And you're trying to figure out what are the relationships between these. And then if you use that 30,000 shot in the dark related searches, you're going to find, well, it's going to explode this, right? Because what's going to happen is you're going to now find the relationships between these papers and all the other citation lists, right? So there's going to be lots of other papers, but they'll be well away from this. And those papers will exist out here. Some of them you will find interesting enough to want to move into your core set of papers, right? So what's going to happen is you will end up finding, just by doing some of this research, broadening your view, narrowing your view, you'll eventually start moving things together so that you're starting to collect this little flotilla here of papers with their references, right? And with the relationships between those and so forth. Right? Does that make sense so far? So we're in the present, this is the past, and this is the future of those papers. So your present is going to be somewhere around here. And of course, right, if you think about it, you're going to be arriving at your own project at some point. Right? At some point, we're going to get to your project, which is the one that is off in the distance that you're going to finish, right? And it will be citing dutifully this kind of work, but it's going to have this interesting core of things that you started with that you found interesting. Does that make sense? Yes, sir.
I actually have one thing. I don't remember how exactly it's called, and you're probably going to know that. So, how is a review or so on such article is called that reviews the recent or the most popular article in the same area, and say CFA, so
yeah,
that says this person wrote this and that, and so how is that?
Yeah, so two different kinds of, or three different kinds of literature review. One, the third of which I don't think you'll be doing, which would be called a systematic review. And those are the ones where you're trying to determine what the facts are on the basis of the literature. So you're going to take all the quantitative studies of some phenomenon, and then you're going to do a survey of all of them, and then you're going to try to find a way of aggregating all those empirical results in order to say something about the world, right? That's probably not what you're being asked to do in your research projects, right? So ask your teachers. If you are doing that, that's a science onto its own. It's basically really that's not the literature review of your paper. That would be the purpose of the whole paper, to do that kind of systematic review, right? Because you're trying to figure out what the facts are. Then there's these two different things that you're talking about. One of them is what I'm talking about, which is reviewing the literature to find out what conversation is going on, what the state of theory is on this subject. And then this other little more specific one, which is more like what has been written about CSR or lean management or so forth, right? So sort of a more topic specific kind of literature review. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky. We'll be talking about it when we talk about how to write the background section. It depends a great deal on how it figures into your project, right? Are the people who are writing these texts people that you want to be discussing it with? Are they your potential readers? Are they your potential peers on this project, right? Or are they just sources of information that you are going to use to inform your reader about what's true about CSR or this industry or whatever, right? So you're either doing what's actually a literature review, or you're actually just doing a document search, right? And we'll try to keep that, but there's no, like, I'm not going to try to make some hard and fast distinction between that. But when you're actually doing the literature review, remember that what you're doing is informing your sense of the state of the theory. Right? That's the basic idea there. Good. Other questions? What we're going to do is, got about another 20 minutes maybe of things to say. And then we'll take a break. And then we can take as much time as you want for questions afterwards. Good. So I'll do this in blue. And then hopefully this will get all beautiful. Remember something that Henrik Nordbrandt said, recently deceased, recently departed, very great Danish poet. Henrik Nordbrandt said, "Do not overpopulate your hell." Right? There's an easy sense in which you can overpopulate your hell. And one of the ways you do that is by pressing the wrong button and suddenly getting 30,000 results and thinking, oh no, I'm obligated to know 30,000 papers before I can say anything about this, right? This is one of the reasons to center your literature searching on a few familiar papers, and then always requiring of yourself that, requiring of those papers that they meet the standard, right? That any other papers that you find meet the standard of this familiarity, this familiar space that you've set up for yourself, right? So you know what you're doing, you know what counts as knowledge, you have an understanding with your supervisor that this is good, and now you're going to find other papers that are just as good, maybe better, but that are up to that standard. And so you start actually finding a way of circumscribing the area that you're navigating through. And as you're moving papers from the periphery into the core here, right? This is going to accumulate, right? There's going to be more and more papers that you end up having here that will make this wake more and more interesting, right? I hope it's looking like a sunset a little bit. That's kind of my goal here. But it should look like, what you're doing is you are building a group of texts, and it's going to end up being not thousands of papers that have mentioned the topic or that have some little thing to say about it. It's going to be a handful of papers. It's going to be maybe a few tens or dozens of papers, right? And those papers actually are the core of your work. Yes, they have a big tradition behind them. So you know that there's a lot of things here that they've written, or that they've read. But what you have read is this core of 10 or 20 or 30 papers that you really understand. Right? You really know what's going on in them, and you know how they interact with each other. That's really where you want to be. Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher of science who wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions way back in the 60s, he had a great way of putting this. He said, if you're going to have a paradigm change, in like a paradigm shift in your discipline, then these are the people whose minds you would have to change. So what you want to do is have a group, a little group of papers. These are going to be exemplars of your paradigm. And so because you understand these papers, you know how they see the world, you know what kind of data they respect, you know what kind of methods they will take seriously, right? You know what kind of hypotheses they will find interesting, and you know what sorts of results they will find critical, which kinds of results that they will find maybe not shocking, but challenging to them. And we'll get to that when we talk about writing the analysis. So you want to be able to frame, you want to have a group of people where you say, if I discover something truly novel and truly shocking, it's their minds that would have to change, right? These 10 or 20 or 30 people, right, whose names I know, were preferably alive, so reasonably current, right? And I know where they work. I know what they spend their time doing because I've followed their research by reviewing the literature, right? I'm familiar with their work. That's the sort of state you want to get yourself into as you're doing your literature review. You want to start getting familiar with the literature, right? It's not a big abstract object, like a big iceberg, that you have to describe. It's a conversation you're trying to find your way into. And you do that by tracing the connection between texts, getting into what they're saying, of course, forming your own opinions about whether or not what they're saying is right, and designing your own study so that your study will continue that tradition, right? You're going to collect data like them. So it's like I suggested at the beginning, if you decide you want to do a sense-making study on the basis of reading a book, and you're allowed to do that in your program, right? You have an exemplar, you have Carl Weick's book, you can search the literature for other people who've done similar studies in similar ways, right? Now you have a nice little community that you can write to, and you can say, I'm going to review the literature that defines that community, and then I will design a study that can make a contribution to that community, right? I can bring a result into them, right? So I'm going to model my work on the work of others, not just to imitate them, but really to make myself useful to them, right? So that my result will be useful to them. Good. One last thing. Remember this is supposed to be a picture of the Web of Science database, right? So it has the collapse of sense making. It has the title here, Carl Weick, so forth, right? Then it had that list of references here. It had the citations here, and then it also had the related articles button here, right? Keep in mind that all of this information, right, is something, it's an entry you can keep for every item in your core here of the reviewed literature, right? You don't have to do a copy paste of what it says in Web of Science. You can make your own little list of it, right? Because you can choose the ones here that you think are most relevant, the references that it cites that are most relevant. Certainly, you're not going to take all 30,000, but you will take some that are merely related, that don't cite, but are just related, and you will have a list of them, right? You will also have the key citations, the one that you find most interesting for the article, right? So make a little entry for those 10, 20, 30 papers that are the core of your literature review. Your literature review may cite other things that you haven't looked at as closely, studied in as much detail, but you want to make sure that the center of it is well defined for you, right? That the content of this flotilla in the middle, right, is explicit, right? So you have the title, you even have the abstract, of course, right? You may also decide to have the keywords, right? So you're going to have a list of searchable terms that you can use to find more papers of the same kind. And then if you then find something that happens to be neither cited, nor citing, nor even related, right? But because of the abstract, suggests a certain kind of community, then you say, all right, well, I want to bring this text into our community, even though it doesn't actually, like, we're not citing it yet, but I'm going to cite it now for the first time, because this is actually an interesting paper that I found by reviewing the literature, right? Good. For once, I'm keeping this to the 45 minutes that I promised almost. So what I'll do is I will give you like a 7-minute break. It'll then be 5:10. And then you can either go if you've had enough, or you can stay and ask whatever questions you have. And like I say, the video for this will be sent out usually tonight or tomorrow sometime. And then you can share it with whoever. All right. See you in about 7 minutes.